Well, thanks everybody. Welcome to the next presentation in our Working Tools seminar series. My name is Andrew Martindale, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues Eric Simons and Allison Wiley as organizers of community-facing data management platforms for Indigenous university partnerships. And if you've missed any of our previous talks, the recordings of all of these presentations are available via our website. And if you don't have the URL for that, I'll try and remember to put it into the chat, or you can just send me an email. I'm happy to send it along. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that UBC Vancouver, from whence this seminar originates, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. The land it is situated on has been a place of learning for Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. And these acknowledgements are very important, not only for our community, but also for the subjects of our discussion in this series. I'd like to also acknowledge, if I may, the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and of UBC's Green College for helping us organize this series. A bit of housekeeping, if you wouldn't mind keeping your microphones and video feeds turned off. I don't think we have too many bandwidth issues, but microphones do tend to create a background noise. If you have a question or a comment during the presentation, please add it to the chat. Or let us know that you'd like to ask something. I'll be managing the questions today, so you can send a note to everybody or just privately to me, and I'll make a list. And after Kisha's presentation, we can start in with a discussion and a question and answer session. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague and friend, Kisha Supernant, to you. Dr. Supernant is a member of the Métis Nation from Alberta and is a fellow at the Rupert's Land Centre for Métis Research. She's a faculty member of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta, where she is the director of the Institute for Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology. Kisha is well known in archaeology, especially for her work in GIS and geomatics and in remote sensing applications in landscape archaeology. She's also renowned for her pioneering work in Indigenous archaeology. I mentioned a few weeks ago her recent book, Archaeologies of the Heart, which renovates the archaeological project by expanding the space within which archaeology explores history and through which the endeavor is practiced. It does so by foregrounding the complexities of human experience and understanding, and including, for example, emotive and spiritual domains, registers which I think resonate in archaeology, but often do so without acknowledgement. And I'm going to put a link to that book again in the chat because I think it's worth a second mention. Kisha's work in areas such as decolonizing archaeological pedagogy and considering the discipline in light of the work of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission into Indigenous residential schools has brought her attention across the country and indeed around the world. For all these reasons, she is a scholar much in demand, and we are delighted that she has been able to join us today. Her talk is titled "Culturally Appropriate Digital Archive for Métis Archaeological Heritage." Please join me in welcoming Kisha Supernant.
Thank you. Just gonna start my PowerPoint here. Tanse, Kisha Supernant and Zikatson, Miskuti Skaikan Otinia, Otepe Misiwaknia. Hello, everyone. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Treaty 6 signatories and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And this is, now known as Edmonton, but the Cree term for this space is Amiskwaci Waskaigan. And this has long been a gathering place for a diverse set of Indigenous nations, including the Dene, Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Cree, Métis, and others. So I'm really happy to be with you today, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm here today to talk about one aspect of my work, which I really enjoy and am interested in, and that's some questions around data and data management, community access, and Indigenous data sovereignty. I am going to present today a little bit about what the history of Métis archaeological practice is and how that complicates some of the challenges around data access, especially around archaeological data, and what it would take to develop a culturally appropriate digital archive for Métis archaeological heritage. Much of this is still very much a sandbox. This is a work in progress. We don't yet have a finished product to demonstrate for you, although I do have some data to demo when we get toward that time of the talk. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to outline some of the work that I've done in Métis archaeology, as well as some of the previous work that has been done. I'm going to talk a little bit about Métis data sovereignty and connect this into some broader concepts around Indigenous data sovereignty, including some of the challenges around this within archaeological heritage in particular. I'm going to talk about some of the current sort of data access models that that archaeology has used within the Métis context, and some of the other forms of data that I want to draw upon in developing an archive. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my current project, which is funded through a craft grant with the Cool Institute for Advanced Study here at the University of Alberta. And this is to develop a prototype for a database which will be based around Métis ways of understanding the past, as well as making space for archaeological ways of understanding as well. So we'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to start with talking about the term Métis. And I want to start here because there's often some misunderstandings around how this term is used within the Canadian context. And this matters because it does influence the ways in which data themselves are organized within various forms of archive, whether that be historical archives, whether that be museum collections, whether that be archaeological sites. The ways in which Métis have been misrepresented influence what's actually possible with Métis data. So there remains a misunderstanding that to be Métis is to be of mixed heritage, which is to be First Nations and not European settler descent. And while that is a part of what this definition means, in that the origins of our nation, the Métis Nation, do come from marriages between European fur traders and explorers and Indigenous women, it is not itself a defining characteristic. It is one of a large suite of things that make us who we are as a nation. We have language, cultural practices, we have a homeland grounded in Western Canada, and we have a history. And this matters, of course, for archaeology, because when we're looking at the material history of the Métis, what we're really looking at is this history of the Métis Nation and its emergence in Western Canada. Part of the problem with previous Métis scholarship is it has really emphasized this question of mixedness, in that that is what we are and that is all we are. And this is very much based on a racialized understanding of two categories of people and then creating a mixed version of them. I think this is a really important point for how we understand archaeology as well, because there's been a tendency to think about the archaeology of the Métis as fundamentally mixed, so looking for mixedness in material culture. We know that many Indigenous communities have members who have diverse ancestry, but are still members of those nations. And I think it's important, therefore, when we're thinking about the Métis, it's really interesting that a new identity and nation emerged out of this particular history and how that all developed. This is particularly important as well in the contemporary context, because there is a rising number of people identifying as Métis in the Canadian census. Now, some of this is a reflection of people are no longer hiding their identity and they're claiming their identity and their history. But this also comes from people tracing back a very distant Indigenous ancestor, say from the 16 or 1700s, and claiming that they're Métis because of that one individual ancestor, what we might call the Elizabeth Warren effect, right? This partial, this distant ancestor means that you're Métis today. And this is, of course, not the case. We have our own history and nationhood. So the focus on mixedness among the Métis really undermines our self-determination and our nationhood and our personhood. And this has implications for how we think about Métis data as well. So, of course, the Métis Nation of Canada emerges out of the political, economic, social dynamics of the fur trade. That is definitely very much a part of our history. And many of our Métis ancestors played really important roles, engaged with hunting and trapping, trading, moving the fur traders through different parts of the landscape, really core roles to a lot of that, but also building strong kinship relations with First Nations. And having a large homeland. So the Métis homeland, and we use homeland very deliberately here. This is not territory in the fact that Métis, the question of Métis title is not so much a thing, because all of these places are territories of First Nations, right? And but the homeland is the place where the Métis Nation emerged and where we had our way of life, where we built our communities, where we built our relations. A lot of these is historically connected to events around Red River in what is now Winnipeg, in Saskatchewan, places like Batoche, but also where I'm currently located in the Fort Edmonton area. This very important sort of core places in the Métis homeland. And this involved things like raising a flag, first raised in 1816, declaring a new nation in the Canadian, what would become the Canadian West. And then, of course, there were two resistances to Canadian dominion, right? So the first in 1869, where Louis Riel led a resistance to the Canadian Dominion of Canada taking over Métis lands, formed a provisional government and negotiated a settlement. That settlement was not actually honored, and so in 1885, the Métis again resisted Canadian control, but were defeated, and Louis Riel was hung as a traitor. And after that, there's this long history of dispossession of Métis families from lands and places. And this also matters for how we understand the Métis archaeological record, because this history of dispossession and displacement means that the Métis archaeological record is very disparate. It's in many places across the homeland because we were moved around a lot. So there's an interesting story about archaeological research on the Métis. The short answer is there hasn't been very much. When I first came to the University of Alberta, which was in 2010, I was looking for kind of some new research areas, and I had gone to a talk around Métis history, and it occurred to me that it might make a lot of sense if I wanted to actually explore my own history and heritage through archaeology, which is what took me to this. It also took me to some of that earlier literature. Primarily, this work was done in the 1970s and 1980s, and it was primarily done by provincial organizations. So in Alberta, the Royal Alberta Museum did some excavations on a Métis site, and in Saskatchewan, there was a program led actually by David Burley, who some of you might know from SFU. In his earlier days, he was in Saskatchewan and he worked for the Heritage Branch there, and he did some work on Métis sites as well. The focus of this early research was on a type of site known as an overwintering site. These were sites occupied between about 1840s and the early 1880s, where Métis families built cabins in clusters and large groups to hunt bison during the winter months. So finding areas that they could go out and continue a winter hunt, which also supplemented a major summer bison hunt that took place as well. This early archaeological work on overwintering sites tended to emphasize a few key things. So one was looking at the use of European objects. So this idea that Métis women in particular were using European objects to emulate their European cousins and as sort of a status signal. This was one of the interpretations. There was an emphasis on creolization and hybridity. So this idea of mixedness, creolization, looking for that in architecture, looking for that in the material culture patterns, basically trying to look for that mixedness in the materiality of these places. And then there was also a dismissal of the use of Indigenous traditions at these sites, so First Nations traditions, particularly lithic tools and napping and things like that. These are found at all Métis sites, but they were thought to be intrusions from earlier occupations at the same locations. And so these were some of the core elements of this early archaeological research. So in 2012, I started the EMITA project. So this is exploring Métis identity through archaeology. The emphasis behind this was really to do a community engaged Métis archaeological project. So what would it look like as a Métis scholar to think about the Métis archaeological record through our own ways of understanding the world, and de-emphasizing these questions of perhaps mixedness and hybridity, but saying, what do Métis sites actually look like? So I started this up at that time, working with Métis organizations in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and looking at research questions that would have an impact on contemporary Métis communities' ongoing battles for recognition of their Aboriginal rights. So because the Métis are recognized in the Constitution of Canada, we do have Aboriginal rights to areas, but we have to demonstrate the history of those areas in order to assert our Aboriginal rights. So when we're living in, in occupying areas that are also treaty, Métis aren't treaty in the fact that we didn't sign treaty documents, although there's an interesting history there. Some members of my family are in fact treaty. Some of them chose to be Métis, even in the same generation, even in the same family. At the same time, there's still this assertion of Métis Aboriginal rights right now. Archaeology had never played a role in that. And I feel like it has an important role to play because, of course, it grounds Métis in places that the historical documentation may not. And it talks about different ways of life. It can demonstrate these different stories of our history. The other thing I'll say, just from a kind of a selfish point of view, is that this also allowed me to connect a lot with my own family. And there's a really interesting connection between genealogy and archaeology when you get to the Métis. And I'll ask you to hold on to that because that's going to come back when we talk about the database. So I started up the Métis Archaeological project, this EMITA project, and it became quite clear that we were dealing with some very unique challenges that were different than ones that I had experienced doing my dissertation work, which was actually in the Lower Fraser River Canyon area. And I want to talk about a few of these because they're going to help frame why we are wanting to build the database that we are. The first challenge, of course, is one of scale. You saw on the map, the Métis homeland is vast. It covers, at the very least, sort of Ontario, parts of Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, parts of northern BC, parts of the Northwest Territories. This is a huge scale at which to try to manage archaeological data connected to one nation's identity. We tend to think, of more bounded spaces, more connected spaces with individual First Nations, for example. But with the Métis, we're looking at this really, really broad scale. The second challenge is one of data diversity. So as a post-contact Indigenous group, the data that relate to our archaeology falls within historical archaeology. So this includes all the materials of the past, the belongings of the ancestors in these different locations, but it also includes a whole set of written records. So demographic information, it includes, journals from fur trading posts, it includes this sort of huge set of data and oral histories and oral traditions from our diverse communities as well. This diversity also means you have data in all kinds of different formats, right? So we've got multiple forms of data in multiple formats, and that makes it, and in multiple archives across this, large set of space. So that presents itself a challenge. Another major challenge, as I mentioned before, was the history of displacement. So many Métis families who may have been connected to certain places, for example, Red River, that would have been their origin, but there would have been a time at which many of them no longer live in that area, right? Folks who have ancestry to Red River live all across, well, the world, but certainly all across the lands we now call Canada. And so finding the sort of local community can be a bit tricky because the people who are descended from the ancestors of these places are all over the place. And that can be a huge challenge. And many times there's not even a community always still around that particular location because of this history of displacement and dispossession and mobility of our families. And then there's also this history of misrepresentation. So the challenge is that places have not always been recognized as Métis places. And there are also examples where certain forms of ethnographic collections or other materials that are generated around the same time period in which we're working, so the second half of the 19th century, may be labeled in different ways. And the terminology might be quite different, and that can itself present a set of challenges. So what I want to talk to a little bit now is I want to run through some of the specifics around my approach to the archaeology to give you a sense of the sets of data with which we're working. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, and then I would like to get into how we're coming up with ways to integrate all of these different data sources from kind of across this vast scale to try to think about ways to connect the contemporary Métis community back to the places and belongings of the ancestors. So the Métis Archaeological project, the approach I've been taking within this research is really one of kind of weaving. So this is very much an Indigenous methodology. So drawing upon a Métis way of understanding, I look at this in terms of the threads of a Métis sash. So the Métis sash is a very important contemporary symbol of the Métis. If you can see in my tiny video, it's just in the back here. It's a very important part of how we identify now. In the past, certain families had particular patterns of the sash that were woven by their families. I have here the most common kind of in use today, the kind of classic red Métis sash. And how I actually think about my telling of Métis archaeology, Métis history, is by looking at 5 threads of the sash. So these 5 threads are mobility, how we move across the landscape; geography, the actual homeland itself and how that relates to who we are; the daily life, so what were the activities of Métis families on the landscape through time and space; Métis economies, what were the different activities that Métis families were engaged in the economic world. But at the core of this, and the most dominant color in the sash, are relations. So this is very much centering relationality, the relations between Métis and other Métis, the relations between Métis and First Nations cousins, the relations between Métis and the lands, waters, plants, and animals of the homeland, and how all of these woven together can help us to fully understand, more fully understand Métis history and Métis identity. So I'm just going to briefly talk through how each of these different threads in the sash map onto data sources. And then we'll come back to how we actually think of a structure to manage and to share these diverse data sources. So the first one I want to talk about is mobility, and I'll come back to this in a moment. The image that you see here is derived from my 2017 Modeling Métis Mobility paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science, where I used GIS methods, including least cost paths, to test against a heuristic of Métis historic trails. So mobility, we know that Métis families were mobile. They moved around the landscape quite a lot. There's a lot of historical records of this. There's a lot of oral histories around this. There's a lot of trails that we also know that Métis would have used to crisscross this landscape. And many of these exist as historical GIS data. So we can take these historical maps, we can georectify them, we can derive some historical GIS data from them. So that definitely is one data set that relates to mobility. Another data set that relates to mobility is demographic data. So after the resistance of 1885, the government of Canada started the Métis Scrip, the Northwest Métis Scrip program. This was designed to kind of solve the Métis land question by offering either quarter sections of land, either 160 or 240 acres of land, or to offer money in lieu of land to be able to provide for the Métis. Métis Scrip was therefore this moment in which you capture a whole bunch of information about the individuals who took Métis Scrip, including where they were born, where they were married, where they were living, and where they took scrip. So that tells us a lot about how they are moving across the landscape, what kinds of places they're connected to. And so that's a really interesting source for mobility. And then we can also look at census data. So from about 1880, although the 1880 census is unreliable, but then there's a series of censuses that we can start to derive data from to look at where Métis families are located, but also help us sort of narrow down Métis archaeological site locations, right? What are some possible areas that we could look for a Métis presence at different archaeological sites? Another thing that can show us mobility are belongings. And so the interconnectedness of Métis with the homeland can be seen through the belongings of the ancestors that we find at archaeological sites, most of which would have come through trading networks, the Hudson's Bay Company primarily, but also various locations in the United States. So for example, Fort Benton in Montana was a source of some of the materials. So we can see the connections by looking at the materials themselves. And then of course we know through the stories of our families, and certainly my own has lots of stories about how and when we moved to different places and why as well. I appear to be missing my geography slide. Oh well. Métis geographies have a very similar set of data, especially the historical GIS data, and also looking at contemporary GIS data, where we're able to map across the homeland things like waterways, fur trading posts, sort of looking at that broad geography, the different sort of eco zones that Métis are found in, which is a vast number of them and different ways to live in those different places. So there's a similar set of data for geographies as well. So one of the other threads that we have data for are Métis economies. Again, here the fur trading posts become really important because we know the Métis were often working for the Hudson's Bay Company at various times, helping to move people and food and goods between fur trade posts all throughout the year. So both summer travel, but also winter travel. Which is something that also comes up in mobility, which is how do you model Métis winter travel, which would have primarily been by dog sled. And it's a very different path you might take on a dog sled than you would with a Métis, an oxen-driven Métis cart, Red River cart. Another piece of historical GIS data that comes into economies are trapping locations and trapping routes. So we know that, certainly even still, there are Métis families who engage in trapping. So needing to know where those locations are, how they may have changed or stayed the same through time. The belongings also show us elements of the economy, that kind of trading economy as well. Beading, which I'll come back to on the next slide. Many Métis women would have made beadwork to trade and to sell, often overseas, and that was a way to have an income for their family to be able to trade with the posts. We also see it, of course, through the fauna and flora that were used by Métis folks. So the overwintering sites in particular, where most of the research has so far taken place, would have been focused on bison hunting. So we would expect that the predominant taxa would be bison. Although what we see from here is that a lot of it's unidentifiable because of the nature of fragmentation. So much of the materials, the fauna in particular, is highly fragmented, which itself points to likely the production of pemmican. So pemmican being a combination of dried meat, dried berries, and fat. And so there's likely the smashing of long bones to boil in order to extract marrow to add into pemmican production. And we know pemmican was an important part of fur trading posts as well. It was one of the main provisions because it lasted a really long time and was very calorically dense. And so it was a common food at many fur trading posts and in Métis communities as well. And here again, we also know those stories and histories from our families. So in terms of daily life, and this is an area where the historical accounts have a lot less to offer because they're often written for very governmental type reasons, such as Métis script, or they're written by oblates, so Catholic missionaries who were out on the prairies. Many Métis families were Catholic, and so the oblates have journals and accounts of what they were doing, but they're written very much from an outsider perspective, not from the perspective of Métis families. We do have a few historical accounts, memoirs, that were told to their grandchildren and written down and published. So we do have some historical accounts that talk a little bit more about the rhythms of daily life, which is really helpful. But archaeology can do a lot here because of the belongings. So many of the belongings at these sites really are demonstrating that daily life of Métis families, what they were doing on a daily basis. Many of these are short occupations. We're looking at, sometimes 10 years or less at particular sites. So they can give us these really interesting snapshots into particular times and places and what Métis were doing. So the layouts of sites, and we've been using GIS techniques as well as remote sensing techniques to really try to map out the activity areas on Métis sites without having to do an overly large amount of excavation. Which has been really helpful, thinking about, for example, how certain cabins that were built on the sites cluster together in interesting ways as well. Another piece that can help us understand some elements of daily life that are less well preserved in the archaeological record are ethnographic collections. So there are lots of beadwork pieces, so various types of, everything from gloves to these fire bags, which were an important part of Métis dress, moccasins, other forms that can help us tell a little bit about clothing and activity there. And then, of course, again, the stories of our families, which is a really important one. And then the final piece I just want to talk a little bit about, and this informs, again, data organization, and that's about relations and relationality. I want to share with you this photo of one of what I've now come to understand as a relation. This is a beadwork pattern that we found at the Chimney Coulee site in southern Saskatchewan. My graduate student actually was excavating for his master's in 2017 when he came down upon this. I was actually back in Edmonton, and he called me and he's like, I think I found something really important. And so I, immediately sort of jumped in my vehicle, did the 8-hour drive down, and we had the wonderful privilege to be able to take out of the ground this relative, this ancestor. This has become a really important teacher for me in understanding how to be a good relation. And it reflects for me something really important, which is this particular relative needs to do its work in my community. It needs to be in relation with living Métis folks. And it's very hard for it to do that when it needs to sit in a museum collection somewhere behind a piece of glass or in a box in a warehouse, where many of the belongings of our ancestors end up. And this has me really thinking about questions of what would it take to allow this relative to be cared for by the contemporary Métis community, by its relatives, by their relative. So this is one of the pieces that has really made me think about what it means to be in relation with the belongings of the ancestors, with the places of the ancestors, and what might that mean for us understanding Indigenous data sovereignty and how we might even organize the data itself. So, while there's definitely other areas we can understand Métis relations, the clustering of cabins that I mentioned from the last slide, my hypothesis is that's family groups, and we see that echoed in other places, certainly a historic record, where interrelated sets of Métis families would build places together to live close to one another. I think that's exactly what we're seeing on archaeological sites. The demographic information can show us those family connections, those relations, those interconnectedness to place and to each other. The belonging certainly as relations becomes really important. And then the interconnections between all those other data types that I mentioned, right? All these different forms of data are interconnected through sort of Métis relationality. A core concept of Métis relationality that I've been learning learning how to embody is Wekotwin. This is a Cree term, but it definitely is echoed in many Métis teachings. And it's often translated as good relations or something similar. But when you learn more about what this concept actually means, it's more than just a term that's easily defined. It's a law of how to be in the world, and it's a practice that involves sort of a continual being in good relation. So to be in good relation is to honor and respect those relations. It's to recognize the interconnectedness of all things and that all things need care in that relationality. And for me, Wekotwin is very powerful when it's enacted through the belongings of the ancestors and the places of the ancestors. So the archaeological approach of Wekotwin and the embodiment of Wekotwin in archaeology is something I'm continuing to think about. And I'm trying to think about this in terms of a data organizational model. What would a Wekotwin approach to data management look like? How could we think about the relatedness and interconnectedness of things, in terms of these files and these objects through Wekotwin? So that's sort of where I'm coming from when thinking about these disparate data types. I want to connect them together, but hold how to be a good relation at the core of that. Okay, so that's kind of the setting the stage. These are all the data sources and types that we have. These are the different ways in which I've been thinking about them. How do we actually enact a data management system for Métis cultural heritage that accounts for all of this? Because that is my goal. I want to have a place where we can bring in all these disparate data sources and create a space and a portal for Métis communities to access all of them, in a way that makes sense to them, that my aunties can come in and they'll know, it'll make sense, it'll be intuitive within a Métis understanding of the world. It's going to take me a while to get there, but we are starting along that journey. There are a number of existing data sets that I just want to briefly talk about. So there are Métis collections in museums. The previous work that's been done on Métis archaeological sites sit in provincial museums, including in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. Some of these, the catalogs remain entirely an analog copy. We've had to go in and scan the written versions and then try to create digital versions ourselves. I did develop with one of my graduate students, Erin Coons, in 2015, a relational database in order to manage some of the data we were collecting from archaeological sites. But it's pretty limited because it's relational as opposed to object-oriented, and I'll come back to that in a moment. There are a couple of existing historical databases. There's a Métis script database, also through the University of Alberta, my colleague Frank Tuff's lab, but it's primarily searchable through names and places and takes you to images of Métis script. So you can access the script records, but it's not particularly flexible in what you can do with it. There is also the Digital Archives project, which has a bunch of Métis data, and it's situated actually at UBC Okanagan. Mike Evans has been involved along with Brenda McDougall and Nicole Saint-Ange, who are two scholars of Métis history. And then there's stuff in archives throughout the Prairie provinces, certainly, and the National Archives. So again, these are sort of existing data sets that sit all over the place, and I'm trying to find ways to bring them together. I think a lot of the things I've been thinking about are what are the challenges in the existing ways in which data are organized, right? So we have these ways of thinking within our various disciplines, whether it's archaeology or history, which are the two main ones in which I am engaging, which are about the ways in which we categorize, connect, separate, and objectify various elements of the past, right? We think about, the ways in which we categorize archaeological belongings. And we tend to group them by material, by time, by different functions. In historical archaeology, it's all about functions. It's like you have kitchen items, you have architecture items, you have these types of things. But what does that actually do to the belongings? Is that the way that a Métis person would sit down and think about those materials? And these are the questions that I'm asking. The idea that they're sort of separated out as individual objects and there's information about each of them, is that, again, reflective of an Indigenous way of understanding their interconnectedness? And so I see these as some of the limitations and challenges of the current existing frameworks, is that they're very much grounded in these Western ways of understanding and connecting. Whereas coming back to this question of Indigenous methodologies, it's all about these sort of interconnected, embedded, lived, interwoven things. And so how do we enact that in data? How do we enact that in data management with all of these diverse data sets in which the Métis history is captured? And at the fundamental part of my approach to this is again that question of sovereignty, right? So we have a couple of models we can think about for Indigenous data sovereignty. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples very much talks about the rights of Indigenous peoples to their cultural heritage and being able to make decisions and have control over that cultural heritage. More locally here in Canada, we have we have several models, but one of them is OCAP, so ownership, control, access, and possession. These are principles of data sovereignty. Of course, for archaeological material, this is actually not possible right now for the Métis because we don't have reserves in the way that some First Nations do. And anything off reserve is governed by provincial or territorial legislation. So it's actually not possible for Métis folks to assert ownership or possession of cultural heritage right now. That's another talk, but I think it's an important barrier to Indigenous data sovereignty. And so that heritage legislation, which is designed to protect and steward the archaeological heritage of the lands we call Canada, can actually work against UNDRIP and can work against Indigenous data sovereignty. So I think this is a tension that we're going to need to continue to work through. And then archaeological practice itself, if it's not done in the lens of Indigenous data sovereignty, can also potentially present barriers. So let's talk about a Métis database. What would that look like? Well, I think we've seen other examples in the Working Tools series of more object-oriented or object-centered databases. Now, while object-centered databases still objectify to a certain extent, they actually provide some really interesting opportunities to be more flexible with where those objects are mapped. So what are their relations to other categories? What are their relations to different types of information? So what we're doing right now is we're working with a group at the University of Alberta, the Arts Resource Centre, which was part of the funding we received to do this, to develop an object-oriented database where we're going to have two metadata sets. So every, object, whether that be a belonging, whether that be a Métis script application, whether that be an image, will be mapped onto basically two different metadata sets. Some of them are going to have overlap between archaeological categories and Métis defined categories, but many of them will be different. So different kind of pathways to get to that same object. So what I've been doing is adapting some archaeological metadata sets to make sense for the type of information we work with within the EMITA project. But then I'm also doing a bunch of outreach with Métis communities around what would it make sense for them to have in terms of metadata categories. I have some ideas, but it needs to come from the community to me. So that part is currently in progress. The development of that will be a community-facing portal where levels of access will be defined by the community. And it will be organized based on a Métis way of how they want to access this information. So reflecting those sort of relations and that principle of how things are interconnected. So we're starting with the archaeological material that I've been working with the EMITA project, so it's manageable for now, but the goal is to make it broad enough to integrate legacy collections and ethnographic collections, historical data, so that it kind of becomes a core portal for understanding Métis history and the ways in which we might want to understand our own history through these relations. So as I mentioned, broadly, we have a lot of different data types. We have a lot of different file formats we want to work with. I do a lot of work in GIS. I need a GIS portal, but we also have video and audio files that we want, everything from recordings to current oral histories to stories, that kind of thing, images, documents, and then of course our kind of more standard tabular data that we might understand within archaeology. So there's a lot of different things, and we want to make space also for 3D objects, for scanning of belongings and things like that as well. So that itself has its own file formats to try to integrate into this object-oriented database. So we're using a platform that's being developed at the U of A. It's sort of drawn from some other ones, but they're creating an in-house version. And we're working with them in part, like I mentioned, it's part of the stipulations of the grant that we received is that they're donating some time to help us develop this particular portal. It's object-centered, and it can be a whole diversity of file types. The objects can be pretty much anything we can imagine. There's still some challenges with the GIS portal, but we're working on those as well. And it's designed to be very flexible, so that this idea that really it's the metadata where all of the kind of mapping and relationality happens. It's in these metadata sets that we're actually able to make those interconnections. So as I mentioned, we've been developing, and this part is fairly well advanced, which is developing a data structure on existing metadata standards. We're adapting TDARS, so the Digital Archaeological Record, to make it work for our particular sets of data. This is important that we maintain the archaeological metadata so that I can continue to do the work of communicating through the discipline of archaeology. I can still query data in ways that will allow me to generate tables, graphs, analyses, and things like that. So it's important that we maintain that, and also allow us to do our archaeological reporting to provincial bodies and to have those things on record. And it also allows us to then connect with other archaeological data sets if we need to, but it does present limits in terms of reimagining the ways in which data might be interconnected. For example, a category of belonging, right? the way the archaeological data sets are very much around function in historical archaeology. So it does present some barriers for sure. So preliminary versions of where we think the Métis metadata might go. Consultations are ongoing. Obviously, in the time of COVID, these types of community engagements become more challenging, but we are moving forward with it in virtual ways. A couple things that have come up clearly so far is probably the most common way that Métis folks will want to try to connect to the archaeology and to the history is through their family. So specifically through their family names. And this becomes a little bit complicated because there are very large Métis families, very interconnected Métis families. But one of the first things we do when we gather is we talk about our families and how that relates us to each other and how that relates us to the history and how that relates us to place. So families are going to be really, really important in a Métis organizational structure. Places are also important, but they're not always places that are named on a map today. I had one of the community meetings, one of the members there was like, you need to go find my grandfather's knife on this trail. So it's like the trail, the connections between these things become really important too. So it's not just the settlement, it's all those stopping places in between. And so how do we capture that? How can we draw some of that out with the archaeological data that we might have? There also may be ways to get in to access the data through story, right? So what are the ways we can enact story to engage with these data as well, or certain teachings? So certain knowledge that we want to pass on to younger generations. Are there ways to shape the data that relate to those teachings? So in our metadata, can we leave space for certain terms or teachings that we can add in and create space for? So again, this is very much a work in progress, but this is some of the areas in which we're following up. There's a lot of challenges, of course. I've talked about these before, and I haven't solved all of them yet, so very much appreciate conversations about some of them. Resourcing is a big issue. So, you know, as the only person working in Métis archaeology as a sort of academic position, I try to get as much funding as I can, but there remain some challenges to that, and also to resource communities to build capacity. So are there ways where the model we're creating might actually help communities on the ground? Because we also have a lot of traditional land use work that's done and consultation work that's done with Métis communities. And sometimes there's good data management tools and sometimes there's not. So I also want to be able to give back and provide data management solutions for communities who may be under-resourced. There's the challenges around data sovereignty. So what does it mean also to have a database that's currently situated at the University of Alberta? You know, what kind of agreements need to be in place around those data, and what would be the ultimate goal, right? What would data sovereignty look like for Métis folks? The GIS management system, so the way they've built Catfish is not easily integrative of GIS, although we have some ideas of how that might happen. It definitely is an important step and really central if you want to access something through a map view. You know, how do you integrate that with all these other data sets that we're working in? How do we ensure that there's ongoing interoperability with some of the existing models, right? We're building one in-house, but there are other models out there. You know, how can we connect with them? How can we share best practices? How can we ensure that data coming from other places will be able to be integrated into this database at some point? What would that look like as well? I was going to show you a couple of examples of the challenges, but I think in the interest of time, I will skip them because I'd like to get into a couple of other data examples, and we can come back to them if we have time as well. So just really briefly, one of the big challenges around demographic data is that there's huge variation how things are spelled. First names, last names, you know, there's in my family, there's at least 3 or 4 versions of my last name that are found in the historical record. So when you're searching, it becomes very challenging. There's sometimes my ancestors had more than one spouse because one died or for other reasons, and that can lead to all kinds of complications in which line is where and who's connected to whom, and that sort of thing. And then there's also some challenges with historical GIS data in terms of sort of accuracy, precision, interpretation, and that kind of thing. So definitely some challenges to think about there. But basically where we're at right now is that we have a good sketch of the archaeological metadata. We're inputting that into the existing platform over the next while and continuing to refine and develop that Métis metadata set. And then we'll need to kind of take it to a beta and test it out with communities to see how it's working and to see what that might look like within the archaeological data we have so far. Find out the best way to integrate a GIS engine of some kind. And starting to bring in some of these different data sources. So we have a lot of work yet to do. I've been very inspired by the Working Tools seminar so far and getting some ideas for how this might inform the work. But the Métis situation is a particularly challenging one for some of the unique reasons in which I've tried to demonstrate here. So I've been trying to think through some of the complexities of our particular set of data and how we can ensure that I can develop a portal that will be of use to communities and to help really connect the past to the future. And this is really important for me as a Métis mother of a young daughter. You know, I want her to know a lot more about her history and be proud of her heritage and history in a way that was taken from our family because of the systems of child welfare and residential schools and other reasons. So I think there's a lot of potential here, and I'm very passionate about how we can best enact this. So yeah, so thank you, and happy to demo a few things, happy to kind of have a conversation. I have some data up on my computer if anybody wants to see any examples, but I think I'll leave it there for now. So hi, and thank you so much for having me.